Welcome to episode 241, Rituals for Resilience, supporting clients through change using culturally attuned ceremonies, featuring Julia Aziz, licensed clinical social worker and ordained interfaith minister. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am very excited and happy to be joined again by Julia Aziz. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she joined us previously for a conversation about kind of balancing the realities of being a human being and a therapist at the same time. And Julia is coming on again today to talk about ritual in therapy and ritual in the process of change. Thank you so much for joining us again, Julia.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me,
So
Beth.
for our listeners who are not yet familiar with you, why don't you take a moment and tell us about your background and also kind of what this topic means to you and how you came to focus in on the importance of spirituality and ritual in your work?
Sure. So let's see. So I started working in the professional fields of mental health and personal spirituality pretty much as soon as I could as a young adult. I started out getting a master's in social work this is the late 90s, and started working in various nonprofit settings, mostly as a psychotherapist with pretty much anyone and everyone. I worked with individual adults, but also with couples, families, teens, children, and people facing all kinds of life challenges, mental health issues, personal, family, relationship, work, health, hormonal, all kinds of life transitions. It was a really wonderful breadth of experience of humanity and what humans go through. And I loved my clients, but there was always something missing for me as a mental health clinician. And there had been something missing for me in psychology, which was what I had studied in undergrad. And so I entered an interfaith seminary studying world religions and ceremony. Taking this path of ordination was really just the beginning of what would become a lifelong training in ceremony and in diverse wisdom and healing traditions. And so sort of parallel to that, I continued working as a psychotherapist, eventually in private practice, which is what I've been doing for quite a while now, mostly working with folks in helping professions and or caregiving roles. But after becoming ordained, I started also taking on work as an interfaith hospice chaplain, providing end-of-life spiritual care, and as an independent ceremonialist. And so I've been doing that for the past couple of decades. And it involves what you might think of life cycle events, life cycle ceremonies, as well as personal ritual, women's circles, and silent retreats. And so this work of ceremony is all personally designed for the person seeking the services. And mainly my focus has been on serving those who are non-religious, secular, interfaith, and perhaps like longing for spiritual connection or feel that, but don't feel a sense of belonging or necessarily even safe in religious contexts. So the life cycle ceremony work would be what you might think of like weddings, funerals, baby, mother blessings, also interfaith or multicultural coming of age ceremonies, and also community ceremonies. So for instance, I've been asked to go into organizations and facilitate a healing or grieving ritual for an organization that just had a loss or maybe are recovering from a conflict. And it's also been working in personal ritual one-on-one. So that I might be asked to facilitate a ritual for someone going through a significant life transition, or it might be supporting someone in creating that for themselves. So for instance, that's again run really the gamut of life, of all the experiences one can have in life. But so it might be supporting someone when they've had a divorce, creating a ritual around that, or letting go of a significant relationship. It might be helping a person who's just had a miscarriage to create ritual around that in a way that feels meaningful to them. And there's also been some integration of these paths of doing therapy and ceremony. So I've worked with a lot of therapists in developing their own rituals, for instance, around how to prepare oneself before seeing clients and staying clear and grounded inside yourself and not sort of sponging up everything that's in the room. It's also meant I've facilitated a lot of meditation, writing, and movement retreats for mental health professionals and healthcare practitioners. And it's also, I facilitate a women's group program called Release and Empower, which is all about gathering therapists, doctors, acupuncturists, massage therapists, moms, people caring for their elder parents, bringing us together for self-expression and ritual. And I call this integrated model self-healing and community because it's all about doing one's own inner work alongside others within an intentional container. And so I'd say while these professional paths of doing psychotherapy and ceremony are definitely different and in some cases parallel, I find them both to be deeply supportive for humans going through change.
Wonderful. In hearing you talk about this, it's already apparent how much relationship and reflection you have to the importance of ritual and structure and acknowledgement. In thinking about where we really start this conversation, why don't we start there, kind of with information like what is a ritual? What does it mean for us to have rituals? And then we'll go off from there. And I'm just excited for where this conversation can go because I think there's so much here.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you asked that question because these words, ritual and ceremony, depending on the context, can mean a whole lot of different things. So I'll sort of share how I'm thinking of it. You know, when I talk about ceremony, I'm talking about in a curated, immersive, potentially transformative experience that has a beginning, middle, and end. And so when one is facilitating ceremony, one has to be present, and there may be aspects of an altered feeling state, an altered sense of time, inspiration through varied creative means. And ritual and ceremony will have different intentions. So there can be a healing ritual, and there can be a rite of passage, or something honoring some significant transition. And so depending on what your purpose is, what's involved is going to look a little different. And I might be using the words ritual and ceremony somewhat interchangeably today. But sometimes, to distinguish, a ritual can sometimes be something that is maybe less elaborate than a ceremony. It might be something that is done regularly over time or on some sort of cycle, though it doesn't have to be. It could also be something that's actually quite short and sweet and maybe even done only once. Whereas ceremony is generally, the way I would use that word is something that is going to involve quite a bit of preparation beforehand. But really what we're talking about with both of these words is we're setting aside a time and space that has some sort of clear intention, and we are connecting to a context that is larger than our individual perspective, regardless of what that specific intention is. And I just think, I'm glad you asked the question about defining what this is, because I know that these words mean different things to different people, depending on where you come from. And I actually looked up the APA the Dictionary of Psychology's definition, and they don't define ceremony, but they talk about ritual as a ceremonial act involving a fixed order of actions or gestures and the saying of certain prescribed words. And then they kind of go into different categories of ritual. But I would say what's different about what I'm talking about here is that it's not necessary. It doesn't have to be, for instance, certain prescribed words. It's not necessarily within a traditional context. And so this is really about empowering people to create ritual and to connect with their own, embedded memory of what this is for them.
Thank you. As you pointed out, those words have so many different connotations depending on kind of the sociocultural perspective. Prior to recording, you and I just talked briefly about how different groups of people over time view rituals. And depending on how we were raised, what our marinade is, as I say, what those words mean to us. Is that about spirituality? Is that about organized religion? How do we feel about those things in our lives? What's our relationship to them? But kind of fundamentally, for me, thinking about this topic, I remember talking with Jill Johnson Young early in the pandemic, and Jill is a grief therapist. And she talked about the importance of acknowledging what was happening. And there were so many people, particularly during those early days, that passed away and their loved ones weren't able to have traditional funerals and grief opportunities because of the ramifications of COVID. And that in and of itself, I think, was really significant to take this pretty standard operating procedure around a death, and then it just completely changes because of the context. And how does that change our grieving process? Can you speak a little bit to that about why rituals, why ceremony, why does this matter for us to think about, particularly as clinicians?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's such a good example, a funeral and the importance of having ritual around a loss. Even the research is showing this as well, that having ritual helps to reestablish and stabilize the mental worlds of those who have just experienced a significant loss. But we can also just look at, your own or your client's human experience, right? That there's the loneliness, the isolation of when someone you love has passed, or even loss. There's a loss by death, and there's other forms of loss as well, right? But this sense of I'm all alone with this, bringing people together to mourn together is not only helps decrease that isolation and loneliness, but it brings some meaning. It brings us into the larger context. So often in therapy, we're dealing with we're treating issues on the individual level. So that, of course, on a one-to-one session, but even if you're working with couples, families, or groups, and you're working on the interpersonal, it's still at the personal level. But ritual and ceremony are a way of connecting with the context around our individual challenges. And so, for instance, you might hear clients asking, is this normal? And even if someone doesn't ask that directly, there's this feeling of, for instance, with grief, people will think of grief as sadness, but grief is also anger, and it's relief, and it's a heartwarming feeling. And there's conflict. There can be so many conflicting emotions with all the memories depending on this relationship, right? Grief encompasses everything, all human emotions. And so having something like a funeral, whether that's, in the traditional context, depending on where that person comes from, or something that's done, however it reflects the people who are mourning, really brings people together and says, what you are experiencing is part of being human, and that we can come back to, no matter how specific your story is, what's happened to you, how unique, it's every one of our stories are unique. It's still always in the range of the human experience. And so ritual and ceremony give us it gives us a frame, to be together in that, and to feel like, okay, this is something that I can live. This is something I can live through because this is part of being human. And I know that because we're in this together and we're honoring this loss. And I think that's such a great question.
You'd previously kind of broken down how we often think about ritual and ceremony. Given how much cultural impact there is around rituals, I mean, if I think for just 10 seconds, I could come up with dozens of ways that we have various rituals, just in my family, not to say of any other family or any other culture. when we as clinicians are thinking about the integration of different rituals or ceremony into the work, how do you as a clinician know when that is, where it's like, oh yes, you passed that big exam and now you're licensed as an XYZ that you've been working for such a long time? Do you see that for a client as, okay, let's talk about some kind of ceremony if you're not able to have, if there's no graduation around a past exam, for example? How do you talk to clients about that? Like, how do you integrate these ideas into the clinical work?
Into the clinical work. Well, for one thing, I feel very strongly about not imposing this type of thing on anybody. So for me, if that's to come up in a therapy session, it's usually because it's come up organically, and it always has to be relevant, culturally relevant, and to the person I'm working with. It has to be, resonant with a person's beliefs and culture and also what's personally relevant for them. And so I'm not trying to get everybody to do this, because it's sometimes totally inappropriate. That's not, if somebody is not comfortable with spirituality, if that's something that really doesn't resonate for them, if they come from a cultural context that their therapist talking about these things wouldn't feel right and appropriate, then that's not appropriate, So it's not something, I think that's always important for clinicians, that because sometimes we can get excited about something and we enjoy something and we do it for ourselves. And that's wonderful. But I'm listening as I get to know clients, I'm listening for what their strengths and resources are. And this is just one area, right? Like we are often assessing, their mental, emotional, social resources, right? And more the physical, what they need on the physical plane. But on the spiritual plane, like listening for what helps them to feel grounded and centered? Do they already do they already have ritual in their life? That might be through a religious context, and so that might be more a matter of, if that this is part of somebody's support system, that you can help sort of remind, like, oh, this is there for you. I wonder how, your community could support you in this, or is there, even asking just questions to know, like, are there rituals in your own cultural or religious background around this? So it's almost bringing up that idea, if it's already a part of their lives. I don't think it's our job to be introducing this necessarily, but listening for, what gives someone a sense of awe, what gives someone a sense of, like, I like to think of it as our smallness, that we are, if you're flying in an airplane, or if airplanes, if that's not a good one for you, then you can think of, being an eagle or some very large bird flying overhead and looking down and seeing all the little cars, and all the, you look down and it's just like, wow, we're so small, and it feels so big when you're down there, so what gives you that sense of your smallness, and helps you feel like, oh, I'm really part of something much larger, a much larger pattern here on this earth, spinning in this huge galaxy, so as we are, and the research is showing this as well, that spirituality and religiousness is really important to people, and that mental health clinicians need to be assessing here and not only addressing issues in this area, but also looking for resources and strengths in this area. So I think that when one is doing that as part of, integrated client-centered care, then it comes up more naturally, if that makes sense.
I appreciate you touching on that fact of, like, sometimes this is a really great intervention and can work very well for a client and what their needs are. And then also, like, sometimes not. And I think you're spot on. It's like you walk out of a training and you're all excited and you're like, I'm going to do this with everybody. And that kind of hesitation, I think, is important, and that reflection awareness of how it may land and work or not work with a particular client. Digging into the idea of rituals, separating it out from ceremony here for a minute. I had the good fortune of attending a Japanese tea ceremony, and I remember one of the concepts that was discussed was the importance of slowing down, the importance of not rushing. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the extent of there's a lot of value in a little time wasted and, wasted, quote unquote. But this idea of having this protected space and time to do this thing. And I think many times we can move so quickly that we don't realize the rituals that may even exist in our everyday. And I'm thinking of somebody very near and dear to me, every evening grinding the coffee beans and every morning the process to making coffee. And that this is absolutely a ritual, but I think we miss it. Like, I think it's like, oh, well, it's just this thing I do and it's my habit. And it's like, well, yes, but it's also a ritual. And can you speak a little bit about kind of like slowing down and appreciating these little moments that are ways that we take care of ourselves and we kind of fit into that larger space that you had mentioned?
Absolutely. And that's such a good point. And I think that the slowing down aspect is part of the medicinal value of ritual it's a separation. It's slowing down the pace of life to do something that feels, maybe nourishing or honoring in some way. And so, for instance, making the coffee, one can say, oh, that's just what my routine is, and I do that then. There's a difference between doing something while our mind is elsewhere and doing something when our mind is with our body, what we're doing. And I think that is a really essential piece of ritual is the presence. And this is how I like to think about it, is that if my mind is where my body is, like we're all here in the same place. And that is a real gift in this technological age, because it's so easy these days to be listening to something while looking at something else and doing something else. Right. And so, I like to think of sort of three elements of ritual. The first would be what I would say would be like a readiness, intention, and preparation. So it's time for me to make this coffee. I'm ready to do this. I have this intention, and the intention is, to support myself in the morning, or myself and my family, to have an easeful entrance into the day, right? And that there's preparation involved in getting ready for that. You have to have gone and bought the coffee beans, right? And so have the coffee maker, right? And then the presence, like you can just go through the motions. You can absolutely do that, right? But there's a way that we can say, I'm going to just do this. I'm just going to make the coffee, right? And then the third element I would call sacredness or connectedness, this sense of there is something really special in what I'm doing here, like connecting to the meaning of it. What might be one way of looking at it. It's connecting to care for the body, care for the mind, care for the spirit, right? It's this sense, I think, that people, I don't want to get too lost in the words here, because again, we have a lot of different connotations with this word, these words. So I like the word connectedness. I noticed that's, if you ever took the, used to be called the Strengths Finder. I think it's now called the Clifton Strengths, done by Gallup. Connectedness is one of those. And it has to do with this sense of our smallness, our sense of we're part of something bigger. And so by slowing down, we cherish being alive and being able to do this, like having our abilities and our body, being able to make this coffee, being able to go to the store and buy that, this sense of gratitude for what we have and what we can do. And there's so much busyness and rush in our society. And we forget to question if it really matters. Is it all so important? Or can we give ourselves permission to just do one thing at a time?
I think for many people in the society, yes, it does feel like you need permission and giving it to yourself. And I'm reminded of a study I remember seeing recently that was looking at the benefits of dog owners walking their dogs and, being outside and being in nature. Might you see neighbors or other people you care about, or, paying attention to the flora and fauna. And they found that 2/3 of dog owners were regularly looking at their smartphone, guilty as charged. We've all been there. And that the benefit of walking the dog was dramatically reduced when we were staring at our phones. And then also that you had the animal behaviorists on the other side saying, like, well, imagine what's like for the dog, like you're not connecting with your animal. Like it's like there's just kind of this automaton that's walking you, not paying attention, pulling them along when they're trying to go to the bathroom because you're not paying attention. And all of these things, and thinking about it, these are all little rituals. Walking the dog is absolutely a ritual for many people. And the idea of doing one thing at a time is so different than how our culture at large in the United States, we went heavy in the 90s and early 2000s. Like we went heavy into multitasking, and it was like, look how many things you can do at once. And then they started to release the research about it. We went, oh, maybe we're not as good as we think we are. And this isn't very good for us. So in talking with you, it sounds like part of it is even just slowing down enough to ask ourselves, what are our rituals? What are they already? Or what do we want them to be, to give ourselves a sense of connection and groundedness?
Absolutely. I mean, I often think when even just like turning off the phone and putting it away, putting all devices away, and just having space, like that alone can be so nourishing. It can also be really challenging initially, at least, to because we are addicted, as a whole, as a culture, to these things. But yeah, having this, it's this setting aside time and space. And sometimes, like you said, we already are devoting some of our time and energy to things that are important to us. But because we're distracted, we're doing more than one thing, we can lose some of the value of that. And so really it's so important to kind of, it's like a certain way of detaching from some of the cultural programming, and, I often will use a lot of self-talk and support clients in this. There's no rush. You have plenty of time. It's safe to do just this one thing, and just taking a breath with it, and I believe a lot of this also has to do with how we do transitions, because there can be so many transitions in a day, and we don't always give ourselves room for them. And so ritualizing, having some ritual at transition points, from work to home, or even if you work at home, your focus being on work to your focus being on home, these ways that we shift, and technology has made that easier in some ways. Cause it's like, I can write an email, and then I can have a session, and then I can do this. And then it's like, you can just move and move and move and move. And what is that doing to our brains? And so it's almost like we have to really consciously step back and carve out space where we're allowing ourselves to have a one pointedness, a just being with what we're doing right now.
A mindfulness.
Yes.
In thinking about the research around ritual, I know it's been expanding, particularly in the last 10 or 20 years, but I remember seeing research that people who have daily rituals have lower levels of anxiety, higher levels of confidence, things like that. What separates out a ritual from that thing I do? Like, oh, I like to read a little bit before bed. Does that count as a ritual? And if not, what would make it ritualistic?
Yeah. Well, I think that in some ways there's a semantic question here, because the word ritual is used for more, like it's not just necessarily a quote unquote spiritual type ritual, right? Like, I mean, in OCD, we talk about rituals also, and brushing your teeth and then washing your face, like that's a ritual, right? No, so that word is appropriate, because that's a meaning of it as well. But to make it a ritual in the sense of where one feels truly nourished in that, right? Where one feels connected through that, and a sense of meaning, I think really does go back to this question of deep presence, because absolutely, I mean, I read at night before going to sleep, and yes, that's a ritual. I haven't like thought about it in that way so much, but it's a way of supporting the transition into sleep, from the mind kind of being on whatever random things are going on, into like kind of into a story, into a dream state, and so if one brings the intention, that one has a consciousness around it, like, oh, I'm supporting myself in this way, and then I'm going to allow it for myself. I'm not going to dismiss it, or act like we can get attached to rituals in a way that can make us inflexible sometimes, right? So but there's another way of framing it in terms of self-care and self-support and boundaries, that we're saying, okay, this is my time for this. I'm going to allow that to happen. And I think that I like to use the word container, like having that container around it, that there's some, I'm giving myself this is what this is for. I think it has a lot to do with the meaning you ascribe to it.
That goes back to that intentionality. And as I'm thinking about it, I would imagine for many of us, clients, clinicians, humans, that we may have more rituals than we've even thought about. Because I'm thinking about it, I'm like, yep, I do that. And like they're total, there's one thing that I do, which is you always have time for 3 deep breaths. And at least once a day, if there's like something on my mind, I'm like, you always have time for 3 deep breaths. And then I'll take 3 deep breaths. And I've never thought about it as being a ritual, but it is. Like there's this intention of like, I want to create some expansiveness. I want to slow down. I want to like give myself a beat before responding or getting overwhelmed or whatever it is. And there is this intentionality. So therefore, there's like this funny little ritual that I've never even really considered as being a ritual. When working with clients around rituals, it almost seems like then there's this element of like psychoed as I think about it, where it's like, well, let's talk about what that even is, because we may have rituals and not recognize that that's what they are, or there's space to be building them in to get these potential, I want to say mental health benefits, but that sounds so like means to an end, because what we're talking about is like actually like embodiment, I guess you will, but from like a mental health, like treatment plan perspective to improve mental functioning.
Sure. Well, there's multiple benefits, right? And I think there's the process, and then there's, what comes out of it. But I think about this sometimes. For instance, if you're working with a client and if you're somebody who gives homework sometimes, or maybe your client wants homework, but then they have trouble doing it, and so then you have to go back and look, okay, see what are the obstacles, the person really wants to be practicing whatever, they're wanting to be practicing, but they're having trouble. Creating ritual around it can really help, and the way I think of it is, finding the time and space for it. So attaching it to a certain time of day, or maybe sequential, it comes after I do this thing every day at this time. So then I'm going to do this new practice after it, because there's something there that really requires setting aside time and space and making it important, making it a priority. And so we can support people in that way. And when, what you're saying about, I realize that I do this, and that this is a ritual to slow down and take deep breaths, there's this sense that we can get of, wow, I'm really alive, and I'm like, we're all learning how to be human. We're all learning this human existence. And isn't that just beautiful? All of these people like really working to, how do we live this? How do we live through the stressors, the many different, and everyone has a different experience here. We're all coming from, have such varied experiences and stressors in our lives, but we're all trying to figure this thing out, and if we can slow down enough to almost watch that, to have that witness self watching ourselves with compassion. And it's like, oh, wow, look at them. They're, taking a breath here. They're like really wanting to be centered and be present. Isn't that wonderful?
Rituals then are opportunities for intentional mindfulness. I'm imagining the burning the candle at two ends client, and then therapist thinks to themselves, perhaps rituals. And we think that maybe that could be a helpful intervention to discuss that. And I could also see a client being like, yeah, with what time? Thank you for that. Thank you for just drawing even more attention to how little time I have in my day to day. Can you talk a bit about what I'm going to call teensy tiny bite-sized rituals? Because I've certainly had the experience when working with clients around like deliberate meditation, for example. It's like, well, I don't have 20 minutes. I'm like, neither do I. And then walking it back to, well, how do we integrate this, and where can we find 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds? These little kind of micro rituals that I would imagine would still have value, to put on perfume or cologne and take a deep breath. There's a little micro ritual. Can you speak about that? Because we are in such a society that's like, we do not have time.
Yes, and I'm a huge fan of keeping things simple and accessible, easy to implement. And so, for instance, in that example you're giving of talking to a client about slowing down, I would say doing it with them is the best way of showing that, right? So I'll say, let's pause. Let's take a moment right here for 3 seconds. That in and of itself, I had a meditation teacher once say, I'd rather, it's not about learning to sit still for long periods of time. If you can meditate for 3 seconds, 10 times a day, and then maybe the next day you're doing it, 11 times a day, like eventually the idea isn't to learn how to sit still. The idea is to learn how to be present with our lives as we are moving through them. And so it doesn't have to, yes, we have to carve out time and space to do specific practices. But I think what's most effective is what we can actually integrate easily into our days. And then it might expand or it might not. It might stay that way. I think actually for a lot of people with cell phones, that has become a lot harder. A lot of people are texting around work into the night, and so one has to, like, this question of boundaries. Sometimes it's not about adding something new in as much as having some boundaries from everything else, So, I think that we put so much attention on like learning a new tool or, and when am I going to find the time to do this? And really the questions we need to be asking are, how do I integrate this into how I move in life? So for me, the slowing down, it's not only about setting aside the time to sit quietly in meditation. It's also a reminder to actually move just a little bit slower, and transition just a little bit slower. The efficiency aspect is there. Like, yes, you might think, well, I'm losing minutes, right? When I do that, when I move slower, but actually you might find that you're thinking more clearly. When you give yourself that room to take your time and to know that a lot of what feels urgent might really not be.
I really appreciate the examples that you just gave, and that idea that sometimes it's about what you add in, but maybe it's also what you take away. And that there's this deliberateness, this intentionality, and that the space that's left there potentially. And I'm thinking too, the possibility of working with someone to try to add in elements to make something ritualistic and more mindful. So if you have to go sit in traffic for an hour and 20 minutes twice a day, is there a particular song that you can play as soon as you get in the car to kind of work with that transition of, now I'm in the car, now this one part of my day has ended, but sitting with that presence of like, this is just, it's not it's not dramatically altering anything. You're still getting in the car, you're still driving or turning right onto the freeway or whatever. But this potential awareness and intentionality around, well, if I'm going to do it anyway, then I might as well be doing it to WC. And letting that be there. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot we can do with that. I mean, there's also just the opportunity to watch one's own process, like watch the anger come up in traffic, I find it kind of fascinating to, if you look at it, your body is still in the car, right? When you're really in gridlock traffic, but being able to sense, it's like a sense of stress and stuckness, though there's actually, like, if you're just sitting there, right? And so, isn't that interesting that we can feel that around us, that we have this sense of what's happening beyond just the boundaries of our physical body, so when we can bring some curiosity to our experience, it expands what the meaning can be. And like you said, we can bring in, for some people, it's very grounding to have repeated, for instance, like I have a playlist, and this is what I'm going to play when I get on my commute or whatever, and it helps bring me back, like you can create things like that for yourself. For some people, if you listened to the same, maybe it's repeating affirmations, or it could be listening to a song, that can be very supportive. For others, they're going to need to switch it up, or their minds are going to get distracted and they're off elsewhere again, right? So in some ways, this is about getting to know oneself and what's going to work for you, because I think we are different in these ways, and what our needs are here are different. And so this is really about feeling empowered to create supportive structures for oneself.
Backing out of the idea of rituals and then leaning harder into ceremonies. Let's talk a little bit about how that part looks. So, going back to your earlier kind of definition, if we're looking at a ceremony as a more deliberate, planned transition space, if you will, how do we help clients create space for those and do so in a way that works for them?
Well, and I would think with this, the therapist role is different than what the ceremonialist's role would be, right? And so, because I work in both of these fields, like how I might answer that would be different depending on what the role I was playing. But, if we go into the therapist role, assuming that the client is, let's say, preparing for their wedding, right? That the therapist isn't necessarily officiating. So, like, what an important work that is, to support someone in their preparation for that, as well as in the aftermath. Because a lot of what will happen, let's say around particularly a ceremony like a wedding that is supposed to be, quote unquote, supposed to be a happy time, also involves grief. There's also the loss of, it could be a feeling of independence, or it could be the loss of, paths not taken. It brings up the loss of perhaps a parent or a loved one who's no longer with us, that can't be there, and so it's so important to give permission and normalize these feelings, like, oh no, actually this is part of getting ready for your wedding. That is not in the magazines, this is part of what it's about. And in the aftermath too, like that, I think a lot of what we do as therapists is saying, like, yes, all of this is welcome here. And all of this is part of the human experience. And so I think, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think in terms of just thinking about what is the role here.
I think you bring up a really important point. I know from our prior conversations, the wording you didn't use, but it was perhaps in your mind that you've used before, is like shadow side. And I appreciate that perspective, because I think you just tapped into something that's really significant. So often, if not always, these transitions in ceremony have a shadow side, just like you said, about weddings, about birthdays, about promotions, about, a ton of different things. So we can keep going and acknowledging that other side to it, particularly in situations when a culture tends to be like, yay, and you're like, oh, and there's this kind of awareness. So following your example, let's say about a wedding, when, oh my gosh, congratulations, so exciting, best wishes, blah, blah, when society is, giving us so many examples of all of the things we should be feeling, not necessarily what we actually are. How do you invite this into therapy? If you're working with someone who's on the eve or approaching their wedding, what kind of ceremony do you have around that shadow side?
So let me just clarify, asking like how I would work with this if someone's coming to me as a ceremonialist.
Therapist. So as a therapist, like not necessarily with you leading a ceremony, but what I'm imagining and have facilitated in different contexts, but to say, okay, there's this threshold that you're going to be crossing with all the significance and excitement. What about the other side? And in what ways, is space being made to honor the family members and the loved ones who aren't with us, to mourn or grieve the paths not taken?
Yeah. So I think it's going to very much depend on the client, because I am a huge individuator. I like to individualize. So, I have had people come to me as a ceremonialist to do a pre-wedding ritual that would be encompassing a lot of these shadow elements, as well as loss, all of that. So there'd be an actual ritual around it. As a therapist, it might be, for instance, talking to someone, if this is coming up, let's say a grief around a parent that is not there, maybe they're not there because they died, or maybe they're not there because of some conflict. There could be different reasons. And so, for instance, if this is a beloved person, one might talk about like, how is there a way that that's being integrated into your ceremony? Is there, sometimes there might be a table where there's pictures, or maybe someone is, giving a blessing, or, sometimes people don't feel like they can ask for these things with the officiant, and so much attention, particularly with weddings, can go into the material world and the invite list and the, various, depending on what type of wedding you're having, just all of the many things that have to do with an event, and not a lot of attention on the actual ceremony. And so, regardless of, depending on where you're coming from and what kind of ceremony you're having, it might be about thinking about, well, something that you would do beforehand, maybe in the hour beforehand, or what are you going to do? Like, what do you need in terms of centering yourself before going out there, and maybe that's a conversation with this loved one that has passed, or maybe if there is some sort of conflict that feels unresolved, there is you might want to do, if that word is like, yay, great. If prayer is like, what? No prayer, then we don't have to use that word. Again, this is going to be knowing your client and what their language is. But to, affirm that you can speak out loud, for instance, or you could write, and you could burn it, or you could do something, you could light a candle, you could do something to honor all of these feelings that are coming up, and affirming for yourself, like, I am allowed to have all of these feelings. And this is, may this be a beautiful celebration and transition. It's not only celebration, it's also a transition in life. And I just think it's going to depend on what is meaningful to the person that you're working with. There isn't a cookie cutter way. And I know, like, for instance, in my work as a ceremonialist, they'll say, like, don't recreate the wheel. I recreate every wheel. It's always a different wheel, because we're different people, And so again, that has to do with this giving things time and space, and getting to know what's coming up for someone and what do they need around that. And sometimes it's not about solving a problem and making it better and resolving something so that then you can go and get married, right? It's about saying, I'm offering up all that is unresolved in me. I'm offering it up. It's out of my hands. I can't, there's nothing more I can do here. And so in that surrender, you don't have to know, there doesn't have to be a who that you're surrendering to necessarily. There can be, but there doesn't have to be. But you're offering that up and you're saying, you're naming it, you're acknowledging it, you're offering it, and you're allowing yourself to have a human experience.
In thinking about ceremonies, like you've mentioned, there are some that are really just expected. That it's like, oh, this day is coming and you're going to do this event on it. One thing that I've encountered and thought about is ceremony around the stuff that isn't necessarily like socially sanctioned, is like the phrase that's coming to mind for me. What I mean by that is like the passing of a beloved pet. That we know that for humans, having things like funerals are really important, and they give us that time and that space to ideally reflect and also connect with that person and potential community and our feelings and our souls. How do you introduce these ideas around things that aren't typically socially ceremonialized? Don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to go with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that, if you know that the person, that this is something someone would be open to, they're curious, or they do this, that's something meaningful to them. I think that would be an appropriate time to, for instance, the loss of a pet, to, you can explore that, you can ask questions. So, find out talk about what that process was like, and is there anything that they're wanting to do around honoring this loss? Like, you're basically saying this is a very significant loss. Sometimes our animals are our closest soulmates, and so this is a huge loss, and it's so personal because we don't have as much community around it usually. Maybe, a family, but that's about it. Right. And so, but encouraging people that they can create their own personal ritual around that, where, and sometimes for instance, with a pet, when you don't have a grave site, that we don't have the same ritual that you would at a burial. Right. But that doesn't mean that you can't, have a stone in your backyard somewhere and you put some flowers, or you, have some pictures and you light a candle, like basically giving people permission and encouragement, really, if appropriate, right? If this is appropriate again, we have to look at someone's context, that this helps, it helps us at different levels, and also at the, honoring and making space for a client to share, for instance, spiritual experiences, perhaps of connecting with that pet in a different realm, or connecting with that pet as a spirit. If a client's going to feel comfortable enough with you to be able to talk to you about that, that is really important, and so it's not so much that one would ever impose that as a belief or tell someone, oh, have you thought about doing this? Right. You have to have a sense of your client and what they are open to and what is resonant for them, and not be afraid to ask questions, and to say, oh, that doesn't work for you. Don't worry about that at all. Let's, change directions. Right. But we want to acknowledge that when we bring up the idea of ceremony around something that is not a socially, not normally done as a ceremony, then I think that brings some freedom in and creativity. Hey, like, I want to slow down enough to honor the big changes in my life and give them some room. And so I think that's a really wonderful thing we can do, and saying to someone, this is important.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate what you just said. I remember working with a client around changes relating to a childhood home. That's another one of those things that can be really, really significant. And one of my takeaways from this conversation is really just the clinician's way of making space for that complexity. And I'm seeing how by doing that, by a clinician saying, well, tell me more about that, and how are you acknowledging this change in tradition, then it facilitates space for the client to be able to do that reflection. And then I'm imagining future transitions to be able to have that space. Clinician or no clinician, like I've said to client before, my job is to work myself out of a job.
Right. And I think that's most effective is when a client feels empowered that they can create something for themselves, and that, for instance, with a childhood home, like there might be that you want to go outside and, before everything is cleaned out, after everything is cleaned out, before you actually leave, like, how are you going to say goodbye? That might be a question. How are you going to say goodbye? Because it might be something that someone's not really thinking about. And then it comes like, well, I want to go visit each of the rooms, and think of a memory I had, that a positive memory perhaps, or maybe also all of the painful memories. It's like, it's part of this integration that needs to happen when we are going through a transition. And I also think, this is something I might not have mentioned before. One aspect of ritual is the readiness, because sometimes there's a transition and we have to let go of one rung before we can get on to the next. And there's a space in between, and we don't want to rush that space in between. And ritual is not meant to, okay, let me feel okay about this so I can move on and close this chapter. Yeah, I think that a more self-honoring way of working with ritual is to give oneself the space to be in the transition that's very uncomfortable, and all of these emotions are coming up, and to have room for that processing. And that if there's going to be some kind of closing ritual, that you are ready. It doesn't mean that 100% of you is happy about it, but it means that there's sort of an internal readiness that that you have to let go in order for the next thing to come, but I think part of what we're doing as therapists is giving people space to be in transition as opposed to rush through them.
I think that's a really good point. There is potential instability, vulnerability, unpredictability in that transition. And it would make sense why any of us would want to rush it. And I appreciate what you're saying of slowing down and giving space and time for that process to really kind of get the benefits of it. And it actually reminds me of the conversation that we'd had on the podcast with Sarah Van Tongeren and Dr. Daryl Van Tongeren about the research relating to suffering. And I remember Daryl saying something like, like you can't just like kind of exit the highway at the first exit. It's like you got to stay on it and do the work in order to really kind of experience the potential benefit, if you will, of whatever that transition is. And that was what the research was showing. And so it kind of just came full circle there for me. And I appreciate it because we do want to rush it. It's uncomfortable. We want to rush it. And the Van Tongeren's book the title was Courage to Suffer, because there can be a lot of suffering in that transition. And we're like, make it stop. But also the opportunity for us to make the space there to adjust, to actually transition within that.
Right. And I think that sometimes therapists can feel pressured by like a client saying, help me, help me feel better. Yeah. Make it stop. Help me feel better. And really what is in service of the client at that time is to be with them when it doesn't feel better, and to be, and in that presence, be bringing compassion around it and being able to be with it, and so that is a real gift. I often say sometimes it's framed as though we're in a customer service role, but we're really not. We're in a deeper service than that, and so it doesn't mean that the clinician knows more than the client about what they need, but it means that part of our job is to have a regulated nervous system that we can be with this suffering. And in doing so, support the client in doing so too.
This conversation, Julia, has been a gift. Speaking of gifts. Of course, there's more to be said on this topic, we can only scratch the surface in an hour. For you, when conceptualizing ritual and ceremony, and as you said, like you've done extensive training in this, and it's something that you've been doing for a long time. For clinicians who are wanting to integrate more of this into their clinical work, what are some of the best ways to do that?
Well, I think for one thing, participating, going and immersing oneself in this type of work for oneself personally is always important. And getting some mentoring too. I also do consultation one-on-one and group consultation around this type of integrating spirituality and intuition and this sort of thing into the work. And there are others doing this as well. What I would say is, what's helped me a lot is basically first getting clear with oneself about the why. What is it that you're wanting to bring in? Like, what is it that you feel you need to learn in your own journey as a helping professional? And that's not like a quick answer. Like, that's something you might journal on. That's something you might sit with every day for a minute or two. And so we're sitting with the question. We're allowing the question to be there. Like, what is the next step in my learning around these things? And then being open to seeing what starts showing up. What are the synchronicities? What starts showing up in your field? Because so often we're like, oh, Google search, training in this, and sometimes that works, but it also, that's getting filtered, through complicated algorithms on the computer. And let's pull back a little and come into, again, like this offering up. Okay, I'm feeling open to learning. I have a sense of what, each person listening to this probably is going to have their own sense of what it is that's feeling like the juice, like where they're feeling the flow. And you might not know, where is this going to come from? Where is this training going to come from? But what you need will show up, but we have to stay awake to it, and sometimes what comes in is something not right. And so it's learning to discern what's not right and what is. But I would say participating in things that you feel drawn to, education, mentorship, consultation, especially if you're wanting to integrate more into your work and you also want to, be an ethical clinician who's, not imposing just because you want to do something, and also that you're, really learning how to listen for these strengths and resources in your clients.
Very helpful. I appreciate that perspective. And Julia, for people who want to learn more about you and your work, what's the best way to do that?
The best thing to do would be to go to my website, which is just myname.com, and signing up for my newsletter is a great way to stay connected. And like I said, there's a link on there also to receive a very simple ritual for closing your workday. I participating, if it's the right fit for you, the Release and Empower Women's Group program is a great way to experience some of the things I'm talking about in action, particularly around, holding space for oneself while in community. And consultation, as well as therapy and ceremony services. You can find all that on my website.
Fantastic. Julia, it is always wonderful to share space with you. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Beth.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.